On June 4th, 1942, the fate of an entire empire was sealed in just 5 minutes. Impossible? Then stay with me until the end and discover how intelligence, not weapons, turned the tide of World War II. The Pacific was vast, indifferent, and full of secrets. In early June 1942, it seemed to belong entirely to the Empire of Japan. From the jungles of Burma to the ports of the Philippines, its red flag fluttered under the sun, defiant, absolute, almost divine. America, still bleeding from the ashes of Pearl Harbor, seemed to crawl on its knees, disorganized and weak. But beneath the calm surface of the ocean, a silent storm was beginning to form, not made of steel or fire, but of codes, patience, and intelligence. Before the first bomb fell on Midway, Japan had already lost the war. It just didn't know it yet. The architects of its own defeat were not pilots or admirals, but men locked in a stuffy basement, armed only with pencils, notebooks, and an impossible mission to decipher the enemy's mind. Tokyo called it Operation MI, a plan that, on paper, seemed perfect. The Imperial Navy would lure what remained of the American fleet into a trap near a small coral atoll called Midway, destroy its carriers, and secure total dominance of the Pacific. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the same genius behind the Pearl Harbor attack, believed this final blow would break the United States' spine before the country had time to rise. But Yamamoto also feared something his superiors refused to see: the ghost of American industry and intelligence slowly awakening from its slumber. While Tokyo celebrated victories and dreamed of a limitless empire, in Hawaii, a group of unglamorous men quietly wrote one of the war's most decisive chapters. The place was called Station HYPO, a windowless basement in Pearl Harbor, where Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team lived amid radio static, strips of paper, and the dim light of weary bulbs. There, no one wore impeccable uniforms or piloted warplanes. They fought against time, fatigue, and Japanese codes that seemed impossible to break. Among the intercepted transmissions, one sequence repeated: 2 simple letters, AF. Washington believed it meant Hawaii. Others said it could be the West Coast. But Rochefort did not. He studied the maps, read every encrypted message, and insisted with a calm, firm voice: AF is Midway. He just needed to prove it. So he had a simple, yet brilliant idea. He ordered the Midway base to transmit an open radio message, falsely stating that the desalination system had broken, that the island was without potable water. A few days later, a Japanese transmission was intercepted. The message said, AF is without water. In that instant, the fog lifted. AF was Midway. The Japanese plan was completely exposed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, head of the Pacific Fleet, immediately understood the value of that discovery. He couldn't just react. He needed to strike first. He ordered the carriers Enterprise and Hornet to depart in secret, and the Yorktown, badly damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, to be repaired at any cost. The engineers worked day and night. What should have taken 3 months was done in 3 days. While Japan believed it was preparing the perfect ambush, America moved the pieces on the board in silence. The ships headed to an empty area of the ocean, a lost point on the map called Point Luck. There, invisible to the enemy, they would wait. On the other side of the Pacific, the Japanese fleet set sail with 4 giants: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The same carriers that had launched the bombs over Pearl Harbor. Proud, disciplined men, confident that fate was on their side. None knew that every move they made had already been anticipated. And as the waves gently crashed against the Japanese hulls in the depths of the Pacific, the real battle had already begun. A war fought without shots fired, where the deadliest weapon was silence. Japan believed it was about to crush a weakened enemy, but in the shadows, The Americans had already read the script.
In the stuffy underground of Pearl Harbor, time was not measured in hours. It was measured in intercepted messages. The air smelled of burned paper and electricity. The men of Station HYPO barely saw the sun. They slept on tables, in rumpled uniforms, their eyes buried in endless tables of numbers. Every radio crackle could hide a clue. Every sequence of letters could hold the future of the war. Joseph Rochefort, in his silk bathrobe and slippers, seemed an unlikely character to decide the fate of the Pacific. But beneath the eccentric humor was an obsessive mind. He knew every Japanese frequency by heart. When he spoke, the whole room stopped. "They think the code is unbreakable," he would say with a faint smile. "But no human language is perfect. Every secret eventually escapes." It was he who spotted the pattern, messages repeating AF, urgent orders, refueling coordinations. It was the kind of noise most would ignore. But Rochefort knew that the enemy, deep down, always talks too much, and he decided to prove that AF was Midway. The bluff was simple. Midway received orders to transmit a false message, open, clear, unencrypted, reporting a failure in the desalination system. The island is without potable water. Hours later, Japanese interceptions confirmed AF is short of water. In an instant, the entire Pacific map lit up. It was the confirmation Nimitz had been waiting for. He read the report, looked out the window of headquarters, and murmured, "They think it's a trap. But this time, the trap is ours." The Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown were set in motion. The Yorktown was still wounded from the Battle of the Coral Sea, its deck perforated, engines malfunctioning, cables severed. But the engineers worked as if they had made a pact with the impossible. Reinforcements arrived from every corner. Riveters, electricians, divers, men who hadn't slept for 3 days. At midnight on the 4th day, the ship was ready to return to sea. Meanwhile, Japan lived in a false mirror. Its commanders were certain the enemy was weakened. No report mentioned the Yorktown as operational. No radar detected the American carriers already positioned north of the atoll. Confidence had turned to blindness. Nimitz, however, knew that intelligence without action was just noise. He studied the Japanese plan, mapped the attack routes, and placed his 3 vessels in an empty region of the ocean dubbed Point Luck, the Point of Luck. There they would remain invisible, waiting for the exact moment when Japan exposed its own flank. As June 4 approached, the American silence was deafening. While Japan tuned its instruments and prepared its pilots for the final blow, the Americans watched patiently, like hunters in the mist. What the Japanese didn't know was that they were about to enter a completely new kind of war, no longer decided by the number of ships, but by the speed of thought. No longer by the bravery of pilots, but by the reading of signals. It was the first modern battle, a war fought on radio waves and lines of code. On the other side of the Pacific, Japanese officers plotted the attack route with absolute confidence. 4 carriers, hundreds of planes, veteran pilots, plenty of fuel. They believed fate was decided, the same fate that now turned against them. Meanwhile, inside the Enterprise, young pilots received instructions in hushed tones. The orders were simple: wait for the signal. Trust Nimitz, trust the codes. They didn't know how deeply they were already in the plan. On the eve of battle, Rochefort's radio continued to hum like a distant heart. The last Japanese messages confirmed everything. The enemy fleet would head for Midway at dawn. From there would be no more room for calculations. Knowledge had already triumphed over ignorance. Now it was time for courage to conquer fate.
While the Japanese believed they were about to crush a defenseless enemy, the Americans, hidden in the fog, waited for the right moment to turn history upside down. The dawn of June 4 broke with the sound of engines and the smell of kerosene. The sea seemed at peace, but war was already in the air. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiruyu, cut through the ocean in perfect formation. On the deck, hundreds of pilots and sailors moved in silence, each trained to repeat the same gestures, as if fate could be timed. At 4:30 a.m., Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gave the order, takeoff. The first 108 planes rose into the sky, leaving trails of white smoke over the deep blue of the Pacific. The target was Midway. Bombs would fall like hammers on the runways and hangars. The message was clear. Japan dominated the air, and America was finished. On the deck, officers watched with pride. It was another spectacle of imperial might. But at 6:30 a.m., the first crack appeared. The attack leader, Commander Tominaga, sent an unexpected message. Midway is still operational. A second attack is necessary. That simple phrase struck like lightning. Nagumo held the paper for a few seconds. His mission was to eliminate Midway, but he also had to be ready to face enemy ships if they appeared. And the reserve planes were already armed with torpedoes, not land bombs. It was an impossible dilemma. If he rearmed the planes to attack the island, he would lose precious minutes and become vulnerable if an American fleet appeared. If he kept the torpedoes, he would leave Midway alive, and Japanese honor demanded total victory. Nagumo chose the path of pride. Rearm for land bombing. Below deck, hell began. Bombs were hastily removed, torpedoes pushed back into elevators, fuel drums rolled through passages, hoses sprayed gasoline. The heat was suffocating. Men shouted, sweating, trying to fulfill contradictory orders. It was like trying to change a ship's engine while sailing at full speed. From above, Nagumo gazed at the sea, confident he had time. But at 7:28 a.m., another messenger rushed to him. A reconnaissance plane, delayed in takeoff, had just sent a warning. Enemy ships detected. One appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's face paled. The enemy had arrived, and he was completely unprepared. Elevators were stuck between decks, full of bombs and torpedoes. Hangars boiled with fuel vapors. Aircraft returning from the first wave requested landing, but the deck was crowded. The Japanese fleet, designed for surgical precision, was now a floating bomb about to explode. Meanwhile, hundreds of kilometers away, Admiral Chester Nimitz watched the same sea with eerie calm. His board was set. The three American vessels, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, were already positioned north of the atoll, hidden by clouds and silence. The Japanese thought they were hunting. In reality, they were the prey. Inside the Enterprise, Commander Wade McCluskey gathered the bomber pilots. Today, the enemy is bigger, faster, and more experienced, but they don't know we're already waiting for them. The young men listened, tense. Some wrote quick letters. Others kissed medals pinned to their uniforms. For them, war was no longer about flags, it was about moments. At 8 a.m., the American radio picked up fragments of Japanese transmissions. Chaos was taking shape. Nimitz looked at his officers and simply said, "It's now." On the other side of the ocean, Nagumo raced against his own clock. He tried to reorganize the deck, regain control, restore logic. But war doesn't obey logic. It obeys time. And his had run out.
If you love real stories of impossible decisions and want to understand how seconds can change the fate of a war, subscribe now. Because what happens next is the most improbable moment of World War II. While the Japanese decks boiled in chaos and gasoline, on the horizon, the distant sound of engines approached, and with it, the turning point Japan would never see coming. The clock struck 9:20 a.m. when the first American squadron sighted the enemy. The sea seemed calm, but ahead of them moved a hell. 4 Japanese carriers, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers, formed a floating fortress. And yet, the torpedo pilots from the Hornet, led by John Waldron, pressed on. They knew they were flying to their deaths. The TBD Devastator planes were slow, heavy, and outdated. They had weak armor, unstable torpedoes, and no fighter escort. Still, Waldron looked at his men and said, "Even if only one of us gets there, that one will attack." The radio silence was absolute. The wind whistled through helmets, the sun reflected off silver wings. They descended in low formation, less than 100 meters from the water. Above them, the sky soon filled with black dots, Japanese Zero fighters diving like hungry predators. The attack lasted minutes but felt like an eternity. Enemy machine guns tore through the air, Devastator wings broke apart, engines caught fire, and the sea became a graveyard. Waldron was shot down. One by one, the American planes exploded or plunged into the waves. When the gunfire stopped, only one survivor remained. Ensign George Gay, floating among wreckage and oil, watching his own squadron disappear beneath the sea. From the heights of the Japanese decks, it seemed like a perfect victory. The Americans are fools, some officers said, but what they didn't know was that this sacrifice had bought something far more valuable than an explosion: time. While the Japanese fighters dove to shoot down the Devastators, the entire sky above them was left empty. And it was in that silent space, in that small gap between chaos and arrogance, that fate changed. Other squadrons began to arrive. The Enterprise and Yorktown launched their own formations of torpedo bombers, equally vulnerable, equally doomed. They attacked again and again, forcing the Japanese to maneuver, dodging torpedoes, turning ships in impossible curves. The carriers zigzagged, opening gaps in their own defenses. The American pilots knew they were unlikely to hit, but even in missing, they created chaos. Up there, miles high, other planes awaited the signal. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers, led by Commander Wade McCluskey, were still searching for the enemy. Fuel was running low, navigation was failing. Many wanted to turn back, but McCluskey looked at the horizon and did the unthinkable. He decided to follow the trail of a single Japanese destroyer sailing at full speed. He's heading for the fleet, he thought. And he was right. That morning, the sea divided into two worlds. Below, sacrifice. Above, opportunity.
The pilots who died didn't know it, but every minute they held out forced the Japanese fighters to descend, burning fuel, moving away from the heights where the real attack would come. The sky was clear. The window was open. The clock struck 10:20 a.m. In war, there are moments when logic dies and fate takes command. It was there, among the floating bodies and the distant sound of engines emerging from the clouds, that history began to change direction. American intelligence had set the perfect ambush. The sacrifice of the torpedo pilots would make it inevitable. In the next minute, the Pacific sky would open, and from within the clouds would fall the men who, in 5 minutes, would destroy the empire that believed itself invincible. The clock struck 10:20 a.m. The fog parted. The sun scorched the ocean. Up there, the SBD Dauntless dive bombers began to emerge, one by one, descending from the clouds like shadows of steel. Commander Wade McCluskey looked at the horizon and finally saw what he was looking for. 4 Japanese giants scattered across the sea, surrounded by smoke and chaos. It was like looking at the exposed heart of an empire. He took a deep breath and shouted over the radio, "All with me! Targets in sight!" The Dauntless dove. The air vibrated like thunder. The sound of engines mixed with the howl of wind and the whistle of falling bombs. Below, the Japanese were still trying to organize the deck, rearm planes, clear the chaos created by Nagumo's contradictory orders. Fuel hoses crisscrossed the hangars. Bombs were stacked next to full gasoline tanks. The deck was a trap waiting for a spark. The first bomb hit the carrier Kaga. It pierced the deck, penetrated the hangars, and exploded amid fueled planes. Fire spread in seconds, jumping from wing to wing, turning the ship into an inferno. On the Akagi, the impact was almost surgical. A single bomb perforated the center of the deck and detonated in the main hangar. The explosion multiplied. The heat was so intense it melted metal and men alike. The Soryu was hit next. 3 explosions tore it from end to end, and the sky filled with columns of black smoke. In just 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, the same ones that had launched the bombs over Pearl Harbor, were destroyed.
Men ran, screaming amid the flames, trying to save comrades, but the fire's fury was relentless. The ocean boiled around the wreckage. The empire that believed itself eternal now burned in its own reflection. From above, the American pilots could scarcely believe what they saw. Each dive seemed the end of a nightmare that began months earlier on the day Hawaii was attacked. It was as if fate had waited for that instant. 5 minutes of justice forged by patience, courage, and intelligence. But the battle was not over yet. Smoke still rose from the three giants when one last Japanese ship continued to fight, the Hiryu. Inside it, Admiral Temon Yamaguchi kept his calm. As long as there is fuel and willing men, there is still war, he said. He ordered a counterattack. Shortly after noon, the Hiryu's planes found the American carrier Yorktown. Bombs fell from the sky and exploded on the deck, opening craters and spreading fire. For a moment, it seemed the tide was turning.
But the American crew reacted with almost impossible efficiency. Damage control teams worked side by side, extinguishing fires, isolating compartments, redirecting power. In less than an hour, the Yorktown was sailing again. Yamaguchi, frustrated but determined, launched a second wave, this time torpedo bombers. 2 torpedoes hit the Yorktown dead on. The lights went out, the ship stopped. The abandoned ship order was given. The sea, once blue, turned gray with smoke. But while the Americans fought to save their wounded, radars had already located the Hiryu. Retaliation would come swiftly. The Enterprise's bombers dove from the clouds. 3 bombs struck the Hiryu's deck, and fire swallowed the last pride of the Japanese fleet. Yamaguchi refused to abandon ship. He stood beside Captain Tomeo Kaku, watching the flames consume everything. "It's a beautiful way to die," he said before vanishing with the ship. When the sun set that day, 4 Japanese carriers, 300 planes, and hundreds of Japan's best pilots lay at the bottom of the sea. The Pacific would never be the same. That night, under the heavy silence of victory, the Americans understood something greater than war. Sometimes, time is not won with weapons. It is won with intelligence, patience, and faith in the impossible. The dawn of June 5th arrived silently. The wind carried the smell of burned metal and salt, and the waves crashed against wreckage still floating in the Pacific. 4 giants of the Japanese Empire now slept on the ocean floor, and with them an entire generation of pilots and sailors. Men trained for years, forged in the pride of an empire that believed itself invincible. Japan had entered Midway as the ocean's predator. It left as a shadow of what it had been. On the other side of the map, in the American command rooms, Admiral Chester Nimitz watched the reports arrive. His words were simple. It was a miracle, but a miracle built by men. The victory at Midway was not luck. It was calculation, cold mind, the triumph of intelligence over arrogance. While Japan relied on traditions and rigid hierarchies, America bet on something new, the union of information, courage, and improvisation. Men who didn't wield weapons, like Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO, became invisible soldiers, fighting with pencils and code instead of bullets. And what they uncovered changed the course of the entire war. Midway marked the turning point. From then on, Japan could never attack with the same power. Without its carriers, without its veteran pilots, its navy became defensive, forced to react. Meanwhile, the United States grew in industrial strength. Every month, new ships left the shipyards, new pilots were trained, new weapons emerged. The balance had shifted. Japan's victory, which once seemed eternal, now had an expiration date. But what truly won at Midway was not the machines, it was the human spirit. It was the ability to see opportunity in chaos, to stay calm when time seemed to run out, to trust that even defeats have a purpose. Every American pilot who dove toward the Japanese carriers believed he might not return, but that his sacrifice would be the foundation of something greater. And it was. While Japanese survivors were pulled from the waters, some wept not just for the defeat, but for the loss of their sense of invincibility. They didn't know they had faced an invisible enemy, the human mind in its most disciplined, boldest, most unpredictable state. And against that, no fleet could prevail. What began as an ambush ended as a lesson. Arrogance had blinded Japan. Patience had saved America. And amid all it, time revealed itself as the true general, the silent judge that rewards those who wait and punishes those who rush. Final reflection. At Midway, modern war was born. It was the first time intelligence triumphed over firepower, reasoning over brute force. It was the moment humanity realized that thinking faster could be deadlier than shooting first. The Americans didn't just defend an island, they defended the idea that knowledge can change the world's fate. The Battle of Midway ended, but its echo remains. A reminder that every empire, no matter how grand it seems, carries the seeds of its own downfall within it, and that in times of crisis, those who remain calm, attentive, and true to the facts are the ones who shape the future. If this story showed you how pride can blind even an empire, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because in the next battles we'll tell, you'll discover that war is made less of steel and more of human choices. Midway was not just a military victory. It was a message etched in time, reminding the world that history's greatest weapon was never steel nor fire, but the intelligence of those who refuse to give up.